Hey everybody, Nick here. Before this episode begins, I really just kind of wanted to give a heads up that this is going to deter off of the 8th Air Force. While we will wrap up what the 8th Air Force did, we are going to split off of it. However, they will continue to be in the story. I just didn't want people to listen to this and be like, this has nothing to do with the 8th Air Force. This is really more about the evolution of the daytime bombing campaign over Europe and what it proceeded to. Without further ado, our final episode in the 8th Air Force. It's February 13th, 1945. 12-year-old Eberhard Renner is sitting inside his bedroom in Dresden, Germany. While in the middle of the war, Eberhard only hears of the war, not yet to see the first-hand accounts of it. However, the war in Europe is coming to an end, and the Allies begin hitting everywhere they can to speed the collapse of Nazi Germany. As the capital city of Saxon, Dresden is a massive metropolitan area. In 1945, the city is populated with nearly 700,000 Germans, and it is the seventh largest city in the nation. Being such a large city, and in the core of the German country, the city is home to hundreds of factories, and workers are a key element to sustaining the Nazi war machine. As Eberhard lays in his bed, he begins to hear the whining sounds of a local air raid siren. Eberhard makes his way to the back of the house, where his mother is standing. Within an instant, the large granular oak door that leads to the backyard explodes, sending shards of wood and steel through the air. Eberhard's mother is launched from the ground she is standing on, landing across the house. Eberhard quickly rushes over to his mother. She is dazed. Ultimately will be okay. As they exit the house and look up, they see hundreds, not thousands, of Allied B-17s and Lancasters flying overhead, releasing their bombs over the city. And for the next 48 hours, the city of Dresden and those that live there experience nothing short of pure hell. It's incredibly important to understand exactly what happened in these bombing runs across Europe and Asia during World War II. While the goal of every bombing run, for the most part, was to crush the industrial military might that ultimately is fueling a war machine. And it's nearly impossible to find a factory or any other war-supporting business that does not have a city and or a large population near it. And while, yes, the fighting in the sky was atrocious, as we covered in the past two previous episodes, what we're going to focus on in this episode is exactly what took place on the ground as millions of tons of bombs would be dropped on Nazi Germany. Even after 80 years, the damage of these bombs are still incredibly visible if you visit cities in Germany. Ultimately, the men, women, and children on the ground who had zero business being in the middle of a war zone soon found themselves scrambling to survive in some of the deadliest bombings of the war. We started this podcast with a little bit of a story about Dresden and one of the children who survived and remembered the bombing well. Eberhard Renner spent much of his adolescence and later teen years picking up literal rubble from the streets and his home due to the 3-day span in 1945. I believe that's a critical point. If we separate Dresden from every other city that was bombed and we look deeply into it, and what we're going to find is controversy every single time. Over the course of the 3 days, 800 Allied bombers, headed by the U.S. 8th Air Force, would drop over 2,700 tons of ordnance into the city of Dresden. For preface, that's about 5.4 million pounds for us Americans, and roughly, what is that, 2.5 million kilograms for the rest of the world. Now, this bombing was not without cause, as Dresden was considered one of the largest railway hubs in all of Nazi Germany. Troops, prisoners, clothing, supplies, weapons, food, munitions, whatever you name it, it was more than likely going to come through the city. And the Allies' intention would be to bomb the city hard enough in order to clog that transport route and disable the Germans from logistically being able to support their military. However, it is also important to note that the raid would only come 2 months after thousands of Americans were killed during the Battle of the Bulge. The rhetoric for revenge against the German counteroffensive, if you will. Not only that, the Allies had recently discovered Auschwitz. This only fueled this destruction that would come to the German people until the end of the war. Not saying it's the German people's fault. However, the mindset of these soldiers were, well, your people did it, so it's ultimately your fault. You know, it's a horrible way to think. However, that is what happens. Now, instead of simply aiming for the railways and trains, the Allies would focus their aim on making an example out of Dresden. This would ultimately be a focus of terrorizing the entire German population. Nearly 28,000 civilians would lose their lives in the city of Dresden, with an astonishing 85% of the city being completely destroyed. It would take decades for the city to finally climb back to its feet. However, even 80 years later, it's questioned, was it necessarily necessary? Were the American forces targeting non-combatants on the ground? Or were they targeting the military? It was hard to say. For the Americans, their argument is simply that these people are working in the factories, therefore they're assisting in the war effort. And that's a rough, round way to put it. American POW Kurt Vonnegut, who is actually from Indiana, so he's got a mural in downtown Indianapolis. He wrote about his survival loosely of the Dresden bombing in his famous novel, The Slaughterhouse-Five, or The Children's Crusade. He stated that once they emerged from the cellar that they were held in, he noticed that the city was completely gone and nothing but a smoldering pile of rubble. But this was, in fact, not the first time the Germans had seen this from the Allies. In July of 1943, the Allies launched what would be known as Blitzweek, or officially Operation Gomorrah. And you got to remember in our first episode how we spoke of how the American General Ira Ecker convinced Winston Churchill to allow the Americans to engage in daylight bombing. He stated the Americans would bomb during the day, British would bomb during the night, and that Operation Gomorrah was literally the test to that. And it was going to test it full strength. The main focus point of the operation would be shipyards, U-boat pens, and oil refineries in and around the city of Hamburg. Once again, millions of pounds of ordnance were dropped over the city. And over the course of those 4 days, 30,000 German civilians would be killed in the city, injuring over 180,000. Displacing hundreds of thousands, as roughly 80% of the entire city was labeled as a complete loss and would need to be rebuilt. The Allied forces' plan was now to completely decimate and demoralize not just the military, but the civilians themselves. Other cities all throughout Germany would be brought to their knees under a wall of fire. Berlin would also be crushed towards the end of the war. On February 3rd, 1945, 1,500 American bombers, protected by over 1,000 fighters, would take off from England bound for the capital city. On a belief that the German 6th Panzer Army was moving through the city by train, the 8th Air Force gave the green light to use high explosive bombs to eradicate the 6th Panzer Army. The bombing was so intense in the city that fires began to spread to smaller suburban cities in the outskirts of Berlin. While a much smaller number of civilians would be killed, roughly only 3,000, it's estimated that over 200,000 Berliners would be left without a home. The bombings in Germany did not obviously last forever. By the time the bombings of Berlin and Dresden took place, Allied forces understood they had the Nazis up against the ropes, were ready for them to fall. And within 2 months, that is exactly what took place. Adolf Hitler committing suicide and Soviet troops in the city of Berlin, the war in Europe was officially over April. Yet, the war itself was not truly over yet. The Empire of Japan was still fighting fiercely in the Pacific. General Curtis LeMay was now moved from his position in Europe to the head of bombing strategy in the Pacific prior to the Nazis surrendering. So Curtis LeMay went prior to the Nazis actually capitulating. He had already went to the Pacific. He was already in charge of bombing strategy in the Pacific. However, something had very much changed. The use of incendiary bombs had rose. The new development of an adaptation of the B-29 Superfortress, bombings would now be heavier and more intense than ever before. For the Japanese civilians, they would be the ones that paid the ultimate price. On March 9, 1945, 325 B-29s would take off, aiming for the small industrial factories and city centers inside of Tokyo. However, even in the mission briefing, the crews were told that there would be a large number of civilians in the area that they were bombing. Once the B-29s arrived over the city, the firebombs they would use would create the single deadliest air attack in human history. And this includes the succeeding atom bombings that would take place in August. The firebombing of Tokyo took nearly 3 hours, dropping 1,500 tons of munitions, and they would leave almost 100,000 civilians dead. The planes were flying so low during the firebombing, there were reports of airmen and their B-29s vomiting and utilizing their gas masks due to the smell of burning flesh coming from the city below. The bombings by the Americans in the Pacific would stay the same level of intensity all the way until they dropped the first and only 2 nuclear weapons in the war. And once again, the civilian population would be at the helm of the hellish nightmare. Between Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it is estimated that roughly 180,000 civilians would be killed immediately, with thousands more dying from radiation in the following weeks and years after the atomic bombs were used. But why did it turn this way? What would make the Allies, and more specifically the Americans, willingly know and target civilians in their bombing campaigns? And there's actually a few reasons behind that, and we can almost go in order. First and foremost, collateral damage in any form of war is inevitable. And civilians will always, unfortunately, end up in someone's crosshairs. Period. Point blank. You cannot find me a war where civilians are not injured or killed. It, unfortunately, is a part of it. Secondly, the war was continuing into its 5th year. For the Americans and the population, they were no longer excited about taking the fight to their enemy. Nearly half of Americans at this point were dead fighting in World War II. And the wounded were tenfold, right? Tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of men were coming home critically injured. As the battles moved closer and closer to the homeland of Japan, the fighting became so intense it was just clear that the Japanese just weren't going to surrender. During the Potsdam Conference, President Harry Truman had announced during the Potsdam Declaration, basically asking for Japan's unconditional surrender. However, the Japanese refused to surrender. They were like, yeah, absolutely not. That's not what we're going to do. But thanks. So, because of this, Harry Truman was left with two options. He could give the green light to go and invade the mainland of Japan. Due to the fighting of the battles preceding, if you look at the Battle of Okinawa, I could be wrong, but I believe it's 98 to 99% of the Japanese defenders on that island were killed or took their life. They died. 90, I think it was a crazy number, like 77,000 men in that battle. Took 82 days. And Okinawa is pretty small, figuratively. If you are to look at something on the map, like if you were to put it up against Texas, it would probably blow your mind. It's a small 82 days, 77,000 Japanese were killed. And then I think it was close 13,000 United States Marines were killed. It was a bloodbath. 82 days. They were estimating that the invasion of Japan, all the way up into the eventual occupation of Japan, would take close to 2.5, 3 years. They actually pre-produced 500,000 Purple Hearts prior to the launch, if they were going to do it. And that's still what they're using today. They're using that inventory, if you will. So that's a little bit of what was to be expected. The fighting was getting so much more intense and deadlier. The Americans knew that they were going to lose potentially 7-figure people. Or Harry Truman could utilize what the Manhattan Project had been building. And that was to utilize the first 2 nuclear warheads. They're the only 2 nuclear warheads ever to be used in combat or war or any conflict. Because of this, because of the bombings, because of the civilian population that was killed, Emperor Hirohito ended up agreeing to the terms of Potsdam and effectively ending the Second World War. In all, the 8th Air Force and their bombing campaign changed drastically towards the end of the war. Curtis LeMay basically went all out and was more focused on just absolutely decimating the ground below. It wasn't so much precision, it was just annihilation. And ultimately, the civilian population paid for it. They were the ones who took it. And millions of civilians would be displaced or die due to the targeting of these bombing runs. The Japanese, unfortunately, would face the brunt of these tactics, especially with the 2 atomic weapons. It's hard to have to say the war would have developed if General Eckert did not convince Winston Churchill at the beginning of 1943. Within 2 years, thousands of American airmen of the 8th Air Force would be dead, missing, wounded, and the bombing tactics would become much more intense to push the Axis powers to their knees. While costly, it was considered one of the largest contributing factors to the Allied victory in both Europe and in the Pacific. The cost of it was so tremendous. The 8th Air Force laid the foundation for the modern-day U.S. Air Force. In many parts, the men who fought are memorialized forever throughout buildings and installations across the world. While high-altitude bombings from 1939 to 1942 was in fact a practice, the escalation of violence and death that was brought to the forefront once the constant day and night bombings began. In the totality of their bombing campaign, the American and British would drop nearly 3.4 million tons of bombs on the Axis powers in the Second World War. In Germany, it was estimated that anywhere between 300,000 and 600,000 civilians would lose their lives, and the Japanese would lose an additional 300 to 500. Meaning the estimates believe that just by bombings alone,
roughly 1 million civilians would die in the Second World War. In our next series, funny enough, a recommendation from my wife, we're going to dive into the first time American, British, French, and Canadian troops fought side by side in the North African campaign. More importantly, we're going to be reviewing the Tunisian campaign that dealt the United States Army their first devastating loss against General Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Battle of the Kasserine Pass. While the North African campaign is frequently overlooked by most common World War II readers, it's one of the most important campaigns of the war for the Western Allies, as it gave them an opportunity to work together, fight the Germans and the Italians without stepping foot into a massive fortress that was Nazi Germany. As always, thank you so much for listening. Make sure you leave a like and review as it helps us reach more people. Also, make sure you stop over on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter by searching World on Fire, History of the Second World War podcast, where we post photos about upcoming episodes, ask questions, and engage with our fans. But as always, thank you for listening. We'll see you in 2 weeks.